The wealth gap is growing faster than you think. Most people think the wealth gap grows slowly, a little bit each year, a small difference between rich and poor. Something that changes gradually over decades. But what if the wealth gap is actually growing much faster than most people realize? What if the difference between people who own assets and people who only earn income is becoming larger every single year? And what if the biggest reason has nothing to do with intelligence, nothing to do with working harder, and nothing to do with luck? Because when you really study how wealth is created, you discover something shocking. The modern economy rewards ownership far more than effort. And once you understand that, the growing wealth gap starts making a lot more sense. Today we're going to break down one of the most important financial stories of our time. Not from a political perspective, not from an emotional perspective, but from a money perspective.
Because whether people like it or not, understanding this trend is becoming increasingly important. Let's begin. Part 1. The world most people grew up believing in. For decades, people were taught a simple idea. Work hard, earn a good income, save money, build a comfortable life. And for a long time, that approach worked reasonably well. Income was the center of financial progress. A higher salary usually meant a better financial future. But over time, something started changing. A quiet shift. A shift that many people didn't notice until years later. The people getting wealthier weren't always the people working the hardest. In many cases, they were the people who owned things. Businesses, stocks, real estate, intellectual property, investments, assets. And that changed the entire equation. Because once ownership enters the picture, money behaves differently. Part 2. The difference between working for money and owning money. Let's imagine two people. Person A earns income from work. Person B earns income from work too. At first glance, they look similar. But there is one difference. Person B also owns assets. Now something interesting happens. While both people are working, the assets continue working too. The business grows. The investment grows. The property potentially appreciates. The ownership position expands. And suddenly, two engines are creating wealth instead of one. This is where the gap begins. Not because one person works harder, because one person has leverage. And leverage is one of the most powerful forces in finance. Part 3. Why the gap feels invisible at first. One reason people underestimate the wealth gap is because it grows quietly in the beginning, almost invisibly. The first year doesn't look dramatic. The second year doesn't seem extraordinary. The third year still feels manageable. But then compounding enters the picture, and compounding changes everything. Because compounding is not linear, it accelerates. Small advantages become larger advantages. Large advantages become enormous advantages. And eventually, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. This is why two people with similar starting points can end up living completely different financial lives decades later. Not because of one big event, but because of thousands of small, compounding effects. Part 4. The Asset Ownership Divide. This is where the real story begins. The growing wealth gap is often less about income and more about ownership. Think about it. When businesses become more valuable, owners benefit. When investments rise, owners benefit. When real estate appreciates, owners benefit. When productive assets expand, owners benefit. And while income earners may also benefit indirectly, the direct rewards often flow to ownership first. That's why ownership is so powerful, because ownership allows people to participate in growth, not just observe it. And over time, participation creates accumulation. Accumulation creates leverage. And leverage creates even more accumulation. Part 5. The consumption trap. Now let's talk about the other side of the equation. Because while some people are acquiring assets, others are primarily acquiring liabilities. More payments, more obligations, more consumption, more lifestyle expansion. And here's the problem. Consumption rarely compounds. Ownership often does. That's a huge distinction. One drains future resources. The other has the potential to create future resources. And when this pattern repeats year after year, the gap grows wider. Not because anyone planned it, because the math naturally moves in that direction. Part 6. The psychology of the gap. Something fascinating happens when wealth begins growing. Options increase. Flexibility increases. Opportunity increases. Risk becomes easier to manage. And because of that, wealth often creates conditions that make additional wealth easier to build. Meanwhile, people operating with limited resources frequently face the opposite challenge. One unexpected expense can create disruption. One setback can delay progress. One financial emergency can erase years of savings. This creates very different environments for decision-making. And over long periods of time, different environments often produce different outcomes. Part 7. Why high income is no longer enough. One of the biggest financial misunderstandings today is the belief that a high income automatically solves everything. A high income helps, a lot. But income alone is not the same as wealth, because income must constantly be earned. Assets have the potential to keep producing value. That's why some people earning impressive salaries still feel financially vulnerable, while others with lower incomes but meaningful assets ownership feel increasingly secure. The difference is not always visible, but it's real, and it's growing. Part 8. The compounding machine. The wealth gap often grows because of a simple mechanism. Assets create returns. Returns create additional assets. Additional assets create larger returns. Larger returns create even more assets. And the cycle repeats. Again, and again, and again. This doesn't happen overnight, but over decades, the results can become enormous. That's why compounding is frequently described as one of the most powerful forces in finance, because it rewards patience, it rewards consistency, and it rewards ownership. Part 9. What most people miss. Here's the part that many people overlook. The wealth gap isn't only a story about billionaires. It's happening at smaller levels too. The person who consistently buys assets. The person who consistently invests. The person who consistently prioritizes ownership.
Those people often create growing separation from people who never do. Not immediately, but eventually. And that's what makes this trend so important. Because the earlier someone understands it, the more time they have to benefit from it. Part 10. The real lesson. The biggest lesson isn't that the wealth gap exists. The biggest lesson is understanding why it grows. It grows because ownership compounds. It grows because assets scale. It grows because money invested today can potentially create more money tomorrow. And once that process starts, it can become increasingly powerful over time. Which means the most important question isn't, why is the wealth gap growing? The more useful question is, am I participating in the ownership side of the economy? Because that answer may have a huge impact on your financial future. The wealth gap is growing faster than many people realize. Not because of one law, not because of one event, not because of one economic cycle, but because ownership and compounding are incredibly powerful forces. And when those forces operate year after year, decade after decade, the results can become dramatic. That's why the people who understand assets, ownership, and long-term compounding often see the world differently. They stop focusing only on earning and start focusing on owning. Because in the modern economy, the biggest financial difference isn't always between people who work harder and people who work less. It's often between people who only earn income and people who own things that continue growing long after the work is done.